Hi, we're back for Chapter 12, Section 2, Civilizations of the 15th Century, comparing China and Europe. Now, almost all regions of the world are touched upon in this survey in world history. So keep your attention focused on the issues of comparison and the interconnections among the regions of the world. This is probably the last chapter in which the Americas, Australia, and Afro-Eurasia are separated and not part of one global network. Remember in Chapter 9, we learned that the Islamic society was composed of much more than just Arab influences, and in this chapter, Islam is viewed through its distinctively non-Arab empires. The heartland of the Ottomans and the Safavids, the frontiers of the Songhai and the Mughals, and even the mention of the Chinese Muslim Zheng reveal the vast diversity of Islamic society throughout the 15th century world. So keep that in mind. Okay. By the 15th century, a majority of the world's population lived within a major civilization. And let's start with Ming Dynasty, China. China had been badly disrupted by Mongol rule and the plague. But they recovered under the Ming Dynasty, which lasted from 1368 to 1644. There was an effort to eliminate all signs of foreign rule, and the return to the promotion of Confucian learning. And Emperor Yongle, who ruled from 1402 to 1422, sponsored an 11,000 volume encyclopedia summarizing of all the wisdom of the past. And that's remarkable. And they even reestablished the civil service exam. Yongle, he sponsored actually a number of important projects to get China back on track after the Yuan Dynasty and the control of the Mongols. Public works, building a new capital, complete with new temples and courts, overseas missions, and of course that writing of the enormous encyclopedia. And in a move to wipe out the Mongol legacy and rebuild the Chinese state, Yongle and others really retreated back to promoting Confucianism and the exam system as a form of re-Sinicizing China, or making China Chinese again. And thus they created a highly centralized government. A lot of power was given to court eunuchs. The state was able to restore land to cultivation. Like I said, they constructed waterworks. They planted maybe even about 1 billion trees. It was perhaps the best governed and most prosperous civilization of the 15th century. So there was a big economic boom. As the Ming Dynasty repaired the infrastructure and fields damaged by the Mongols, the state set in motion substantial economic growth. And there were also maritime voyages. Chinese sailors and traders had become rather important in the South China Sea and the Southeast Asian ports in the 11th century. And Emperor Yongle commissioned a massive fleet that he launched in 1405. These were the voyages of Zheng He. Hopefully you can see, this is how you spell his name. Zheng He is how it's pronounced. And he was this was one of the most remarkable moments in the Ming Dynasty, were these massive fleets. And they were commanded by Admiral Zheng He. For several decades, hundreds of ships with 27,000 men sailed the China Seas and the Indian Ocean in an effort to demonstrate Chinese power. However, this was not a mission to colonize or to conquer, but rather a trade mission that encouraged the expansion of the tribute state system. And the fleet was suddenly recalled and scuffed in the 1430s as the Chinese government stopped those voyages, and the Ming turned away from sending merchants out to the world and instead wanted the world come to China. And many of those government officials did that because they saw these voyages as a waste of their resources. Nonetheless, Chinese merchants and craftsmen continued to settle and trade in Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan, and other parts of Southeast Asia, but they did so without government support. Okay, European comparisons and state building and cultural renewal. Okay, there was a similar process of demographic recovery from the plague that happened in Europe. Consolidation, a big cultural flowering, and European expansion also took place in Western Europe. The European population began to rise again around 1450. And state building was also on the rise. It was rather fragmented because of how different Europeans were. But, I mean, there were many different independent and competitive states, all competing with each other for wealth and for power. So, many of those smaller states were in constant conflict. And that's in a large contrast to China, because Europe was a region divided in many smaller states. They were constantly fighting with each other. Like, for example, the 100 Years' War, which was 1337 to 1453 between France and England, is a great example. And the 100 Years' War it's actually rather important because that was after by the end of that war. This is really the first big surge of nationalism that we see from Europeans. Now, the Renaissance, which happened, which began around this time of cultural flowering and this increase in population, it was a reclamation of classical Greco-Roman traditions. It began in the commercial cities of Italy around 1350 or 1500, just depending on the city. And it was a returning to the sources as a cultural standard to imitate. And we see a turn to greater naturalism in art, especially like those of Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, Michelangelo, all three very famous Italian artists, or Renaissance men, if you will. And the humanist scholars explored secular topics in addition to religious matters. So there wasn't just a focus on religious matters, but also the secular and political topics. Renaissance humanism started really in northern Italy. It was a revival of the Greco-Roman traditions like art, philosophy. They focused on the achievements of individuals and on real-world practicalities. The ideology of the Renaissance, which is what's known as humanism, was a direct challenge to the otherworldly spiritualism of the church. Christine de Pizan wrote against misogyny, which is the hatred of women. And that was very important because that's a completely new idea, especially in such a heavily patriarchal society. And the Renaissance scholars were heavily concerned with describing the world as it is rather than exploring eternal truths like they had been in the past. And there's that focus on individuals and achieving and what's there in front of them. And this is a map that shows in red Ming Dynasty China, in green Timur's Empire, about 1405. We learned about him in section 1. The Delhi Sultanate there in northern India, and the Vijayanagara, which is here in southern India. The blue arrows, which I think are very helpful, show you the routes of the Ming Dynasty voyages, many of those from Zheng He, all here in the South China Sea. down into Southeast Asia, and then of course out into the Bay of Bengal along India, and there in the Indian Ocean. And he made it to many parts of Africa and even Southwest Asia. And here's a map that shows you how fragmented those political states of Europe are, or were, and why they were in constant conflict with one another. You can see how different it is. So, we're looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 17 or 18, maybe 19 different competing states in Europe. Here specifically is the Holy Roman Empire. Obviously, it's not centered around the Mediterranean Sea like the old Roman Empire was. We've talked about that shift and the focus to the north. But so many different and competing states in Europe. And you can even see, large parts of Spain are what it looks like now. The same thing with Portugal. Obviously, part of the Holy Roman Empire is now part of France. But other states, in England and Ireland, Scotland generally look the same. But you can see here, for example, Italy, very fragmented, really focusing on those city-states and those highly commercial areas in Italy where we see the birth of the Renaissance. But obviously, this is very different. Eastern Europe is very different than what it is today. Okay, European comparisons, maritime voyaging. The Portuguese voyages of discovery began in 1415. And by 1492, Columbus had reached the Americas. 1497, 1498, Vasco da Gama sailed around Africa and reached India. And those European voyages actually were rather small compared to the Chinese voyages. But unlike the Chinese, the Europeans were seeking wealth, converts, allies, especially in their crusades against Islam. And the Europeans used violence to carve out their empires, which is very different than the purpose of those voyages conducted by the Chinese. But as the Chinese voyages ended, the European voyages escalated. There was no overarching political authority in Europe to end the voyages, as many different Europeans embarked on their own different voyages. And so the rivalry between those states really encouraged exploration, was part of that escalation that I just talked about. And the European elite was really interested in overseas expansion. And so there's a market for exploration, and there's a market for why these are escalating. The European elite wanted those goods from Asia. And China, in a sense, they believed they had all that they needed. Remember, the Chinese said, you know what? They could come here. Let the world come to China. We have it all. And the Europeans wanted the greater riches of the East, and thus leading to a higher percentages of those being involved in the voyages. And China's food production could expand internally, but the European system expanded by acquiring new lands, because the Chinese did have so much land at their disposal. And so we see Portugal taking the lead in 1415. With support of the Pope, they launched a series of voyages that culminated essentially in Vasco da Gama leaving Portugal for India. Columbus, sailing for Portugal's rival Spain, reached the Americas. And the Europeans had smaller ships and fleets than the Chinese. The most obvious contrast between the two maritime forces was the size of the ships and the fleets. While Shanghai had hundreds of ships and approximately 27,000 men, the Iberians sent out a handful of ships with small crews, maybe around 100. And so this showed a dramatic difference in power and wealth. And of course their motives, like I just mentioned, and their goals were different, and receiving that support as well. China was wealthy, so it had no need to expand overseas. China was very centralized. The state were the ones that made major decisions, and they decided to stop the voyages. And so it could do so very quickly. But the Europeans, on the other hand, they were desperate, they were poor, they wanted to break out into the larger world economy, and they really wanted to be part of that Indian Ocean trade themselves, as opposed to having to go through the Muslim lands in order to do so. And so, it could lose out to its rivals. And in Europe, the merchants saw economic opportunities, monarchs saw new tax revenues, and the church also saw a way to expand the faith. So there were many more push factors in the poor and isolated Europe than there were in the wealthy and more confident China. And this last map right here shows you the voyages of the Portuguese, right, Vasco da Gama sailing around the Horn of Africa, and not the Horn of Africa, excuse me, the Horn of Africa is over here, sailing around the tip of Africa and the Cape of Good Hope on to India. And of course the blue, right, that was Zheng He's voyages there. And you see some of the different empires that existed in Africa and who they came into contact with. Of course, we've talked about these people over here in Africa. We've already mentioned Axum before. And of course, we've learned about Zimbabwe and Great Zimbabwe. And this concludes Section 2. I will see you for Section 3, the civilizations of the 15th century, the Islamic world.